Welcome back. Thank you so much. I think a couple more people are trickling in, but I do want to try to get us back on time a bit. And part of how we'll do that is we will make this session just a little bit shorter to kind of get us back on schedule, because one of the things that we've noticed running a festival like this is that we sometimes just pack too many things into a day for it to be enjoyable for everyone anymore, and we don't want to do that. So I'll get us back on track and make sure that we have a nice break for the next one, etc. So this will still end at the time that this session was supposed to end at. And I think that's all I'll say so we can get started. So I'll invite our conversation starters to join me in the center for the international conversation. You can sit there.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, no. That should obey your impulse.
That's okay. No, I'm not. It's fine. Here we are.
This conversation obviously is the international context, and so in what context are we talking about is something that was proposed to me right away when I started to talk with some of our conversation starters. And so just before we introduce ourselves briefly, I'll just say that what we kind of discovered was really important in this conversation was that it's actually two conversations. One is, what is the context for Canada and Canadian artists to be involved in international scenes and international markets? And the other, just as important conversation is, what are the opportunities for international folks to come to Canada and also be here? And for me, that really resonated with what Edom had offered us in the last session, just about how can there be reciprocity in these relationships. So maybe we'll go around counterclockwise, and Iman, you can just introduce yourself briefly first.
Sure. Hi, my name is Iman. I'm an artist and researcher based in Devon in the UK, and my practice explores the world-making capacities of plants, soils and people. And I'm here as an artist in residence with Agnes in collaboration with Cubes, the Queen's University Biological Field Station, and then also in partnership with FoLDA.
I'm Naomi Campbell. I live in Toronto. I currently work freelance in a range of roles, but my international experience comes primarily from working in festivals. I was the artistic director at Luminato for 5 years, 2 of which were COVID, so international in theory, but not in real life. And before that, my international experience was largely as a producer touring works with Mammalian Diving Reflex and others internationally. And yeah, happy to be here.
Hi, my name is Gala Hernández. I'm an artist, filmmaker, a researcher from Spain, but based usually in Berlin and right now in Toronto because I'm an artist in residence at Connected Minds at York University. And I guess that's why I'm here as well. So now I live in Toronto since February. But I've lived in Madrid, Barcelona, Paris, and Berlin, and now Canada. Happy to be here as well.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Clayton. I'm a artist, curator. Oh, sorry, did I do the wrong order?
No, you're doing it.
Perfect.
What am I? Artist, curator. I'm based in Birmingham. I'm from Toronto. My kind of primary realm of work is in contemporary performance, but I dabble in other things. I have famously dabbled in theater. I famously dabbled in architecture. A group show I'm part of is representing Canada at the Venice Biennale of Architecture this year. I do random things. I do whatever, wherever the wind takes me, is what I do. And and I currently run the Fierce Festival in Birmingham, UK, which is a live art festival. Sorry, I'm good.
Perfect. Good segue. And so how I wanted to start this conversation actually, Clayton, was to throw back to you, because part of what we talked about when we had our pre-meeting, we talked about how actually we're going to talk about opportunities for artists, I think I'll say, who live in Canada, that the opportunities for French-speaking artists and English-speaking artists are really quite different. And to just kind of talk blanketly about that would probably not do the discussion of service. And so I wondered if you wanted to just jump in terms of that distinction.
Yeah, I can speak to it from an international kind of presenter context. And I don't necessarily define it so neatly as like English language or French language. It's folks who live in Quebec versus folks who don't, right? And the kind of reality is Quebec simply loves investing in arts and culture in the way that the rest of the country does not. So that they kind of works, again, in the kind of lens of contemporary performance. The artists that often get opportunities to tour are Quebec ones, right? And it's linked to any number of larger kind of initiatives pushed forward by Quebec. If we think about FTA, for example, that's just finished, they pay for international presenters to come, free accommodation, free travel, et cetera, et cetera. So that's an immediate kind of leg up. And in addition to kind of Canada Council funding, there's also additional funding bodies that kind of support Quebec artists to move outward in ways that are asymmetrical, certainly, to Ontario, which I'm quite familiar with, but also I imagine the rest of the country.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Did you want to pick up on that at all, Naomi? Just like someone who's trying to program recently?
Yeah, I mean, I also just, if I could, just to harken back to the conversation earlier today and yesterday about the interesting thing about the reason that Quebec has that kind of funding is because Quebec's government is interested in nation building and nation maintenance and, identity and language and all of the things that English Canada has always struggled with, and that it was a very conscious cultural, protection decision on the part of their government, which obviously they've done very well by. And a lot of European presenters, when they talk about Canadian work, they only mention Quebec work, and that's because, this is a little less so now. I would say less so in the last, 10 years, but prior to that, it's because that's what could afford to travel. And I do think when you look at the stuff that gets presented internationally, even in Canada and out of Canada, the larger works until recently, and we spoke about the National Creation Fund yesterday, but all of that, the work that tends to get, lauded, booked, well reviewed, is a lot of it has been from Quebec because they've had more time and resources to make the work. I don't think it's because, Quebecois artists are inherently more talented than English Canadian artists. I think it's because of resources and priorities on the part of that government. So that also makes it easier to book a show from Quebec than from British Columbia, not because of, and let's say that the travel is the same, but because you probably don't have to pay for the travel for the Quebec artists, and you do have to pay for the travel for the artists from BC. So just from a pure presentation perspective, the stories that have come across the country, largely in Canada they would be in dance, but internationally have come out of Quebec for that reason, just because it's easier and it's less pressure on the presenter. And again, the FTA doesn't have more money, but doesn't have to spend all of their money on the same things, I would say. And they have more venues, and there are other ways of presenting the work in Montreal that are easier. It makes it easier to do, and an audience that's been going to the theater and dance forever. That's the other thing. There's an audience, and that's a different thing.
Gala, you mentioned in our conversation, maybe actually I don't want to give away what you might say, but I'll just say that you had not anticipated living here until you did, because of Connected Minds. And I just wonder, what was your experience of what Canadian culture was before you came here, and has it changed at all from being here?
Yeah, as I said, I wasn't anticipating it, and I'm very happy to be here, actually. I didn't have any idea or mental representation of Canada or Toronto, actually, in my mind before moving here. Maybe because of, the lack of cultural products that arrive from, actually in the last years, in cinema, because that's the industry that I know. Yeah, in film. I don't know much, unfortunately, about theater, Canadian theater, but in film, in the last years, it's true that there's more and more Canadians co-production happening with Europe, especially with Quebec, of course, but also not only with Quebec, also from the rest of. But I wouldn't say it's a country that I had a clear picture of in my mind, unfortunately. And now I really like it, so it's a very nice discovery. But I guess cultural imperialism from the US is kind of the kind of products that come from this side of the world to Europe.
So we're kind of co-identified with that imperialism.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Did you? What's your take on this, Iman?
Yeah, I mean, I'm also the same as Gala. I didn't anticipate working in Canada in any way as an artist, but I did have a connection through family living in Toronto specifically, and so it always felt like a place that I visited and would call like a second home because of family connections here. And so that was quite interesting. But for me, like, I think because my work is so site specific and so site based, there's always sort of been this question as to like what it means to make a work in response to a landscape that I'm not local to. And working like within a residency capacity in lots of different places. I was based in London before, but then ended up kind of my practice ended up kind of taking root in Devon and Cornwall and in the southwest landscape of England. And so from there, like, I started as someone who was looking into invasive species, almost thinking, am I an invasive species here in this new landscape? And what does it mean to belong, or for my work to belong in this place? And so there was always that kind of question sort of going on in my mind, what it means like in landscapes where like you are trying to find more kind of healthy relationships and more interactive and reciprocal relationships, as you mentioned before, what it means to sort of create work in response to a site that you don't necessarily belong to. So that was kind of where I started. But I was also thinking of that in relationship to artists that I really admire who do kind of take on residencies in that way, who kind of question that very notion of feeling like alien and invasive, and the language that we use around kind of nation states and where that language of settler and native have come from. And I'm thinking of an artist like Ingrid Pollard, for example, who worked on a long-term 3-year research residency in Devon around the Fern, and was able to kind of unpack a really amazing local history of folklore around this specific species through being someone who wasn't from that place as well. And so I think there's something kind of interesting in that interaction and exchange that, like, I don't know what that is yet for me, but it's kind of nice to also be in that process as well.
Before we go to opportunities for international artists, which I think is an important part of this conversation, I just wanted to kind of stick on this. So, like, I feel like we kind of have established that there are, in fact, better opportunities for Quebec-based artists. Okay. This makes me reflect actually on something that Naomi and I worked on a long time ago, which was a political organization called Department of Culture, which was invested in the 2008 election, which was like an arts election. And I went to like a pollster thing afterwards, where this Peter Donello, this pollster, had done a poll about like all the arts activism that happened in the election. And he polled both Quebec and English Canada. And the English Canada response was basically like that they kind of agreed with the Prime Minister at the time, Prime Minister Harper, who said that like ordinary Canadians don't care about the arts, was this big phrase that came around there. And that actually like that was a, this kind of that like supporting the arts as a waste of tax dollars was a thing that still resonated even after that election. It didn't go that well for them, but that it just destroyed them in Quebec, and they pretty much lost the election in Quebec because this idea of cutting arts and culture was so unpopular there that they just didn't win a single seat in that province. Hard to form government when you do that. And so it makes me reflect that the problem is not just money, but convincing the other people in not Quebec that the money is a good idea. So my question for the panelists is like, how does anyone have any thoughts on how we could show the value of the work that we do to folks like outside of those who come to FoLDA? You know, like I think I don't need to convince anyone in this room that probably more arts investment is probably a good idea, but I think that the challenge is a political one, but political challenges are overcomable. Does anyone have a thought for that?
You're asking how we could explain to people why art is important?
I think so. But I don't think we ask ourselves that often. And it's like we have one sector of that has a different set of resources because their supporters do believe it.
I can contribute with an example from France,
Yes, please.
maybe. What happened in France is, well, you know, the CNC is like the public institution that funds cinema in France. It's actually an example of kind of good practices, or like in Europe, it's like the model that all the other countries want to copy. Because it's public, but it's it's autonomous financially and economically. So it doesn't rely on government subsidies or, actually in 2013, the government was going through like a crisis of budget and took millions from the CNC for other stuff. So it's kind of an example of a very healthy industry. But the public opinion does not agree with that. They don't know this, actually. Like the facts, they don't know. Mm-hmm. So what happened was that Justine Triet won the Palme d'Or, and she made this discourse when she won, saying, she's a French filmmaker, very critical with the government, with how they're like cutting the funding for art in France as well. And then all the government members were like, oh, she's so ungrateful. She's like biting the hand that feeds her. And everyone like on social media was so like mad at her and like criticizing that she was ungrateful because cinema is a subsidized industry, right? Like it's like you're stealing public money basically and you're living out of public money. It's not true. Like I was doing research after this because I was like, how much of this is true? And then a lot of journalists were doing this work as well of like publishing the actual financial data. So the CNC is actually completely autonomous, and there's something very interesting of how it works, how it's funded, which is for each ticket that someone buys to go to a movie in the cinema in France, I think it's 11%, almost 11% of this money goes directly to the CNC to fund French films.
Wow.
So it means that they take money from the box office success of American blockbusters, and they take 10% of this money directly to fund author French cinema, which is a very nice way, a very good example, I think, of fighting this cultural hegemony, right, of the U.S. cinema.
That's an amazing example.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's like exactly what I was hoping for. Anyone else have like, how could we get like people on board with treating all of Canada like Quebec culturally?
I think all of Canada is, again, go back to the notion of nations. Like,
Sure.
we are a country of many nations,
Okay.
where the First Nations and other nations look at the cultural differences between Newfoundland and Alberta, and the connections between them, or the difference between Southern Ontario and the Yukon, or whatever. There's so many different. And I think the density of population is part of the thing. Like, Quebec is, as a settler community, the oldest settler community in Canada. It is densely populated in a, geography. France, Spain, European countries are small, are densely populated. The United States is way more densely populated than we are. So I think like looking at Canada as a whole, it makes it challenging. So it's like maybe the way is to think about like how if like you invigorate nationally, like I'm not talking about separating ourselves into 13 different entities. I don't think that's a good idea. But I do think there are ways of like solidifying that the local responsibilities, right? The local commitment to the culture in your region, the provincial supports for things are actually get to people faster, more effectively, and don't separate us as much. Like when you're on a Canada Council jury and you have to do some kind of geographic, be fair across the country. It's not actually possible. But if you wanted to be fair within a province or within a city, you can actually affect a different kind of support and change. And I think that's just because it's such a big expanse, and so people don't know each other. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I just spent time with cousins from British Columbia, from Vancouver, and one of whom, just really quickly, one of whom's quite right wing, has not spent time in Toronto except to go to like a conference and the casino, had never spent time in our neighborhood and just was like, wow, like this is different than I thought, and met my, queer family and was like, oh, like they're not so bad as I, like he was actually really like experiencing something that he'd never experienced, because he was coming to another country, and he was like, he was coming, another nation, but as he was my family, he came in my house, he experienced something different than he experiences in his house, and we're better for it, And I think so. I do think there's international is also intranational. Like, what do we do about this? I think it's what's very interesting about this moment in Canada about interprovincial trade is also what's the interprovincial cultural trade that can happen out of that too. Like, what's the opportunity there for us in this moment to distinguish ourselves from America, the United States perhaps, but how can that actually benefit the artists in the country? I think it's an amazing moment to say, okay, Mr. Carney, you want us to be Canada? Well, then let's just reinforce the cultural voices that we have here, which are from all over the world, which comes back to the international. We are, as a country of settlers and immigrants, the stories and the voices and that matter here are from all over the world.
I wonder whether it's also about almost creating a series of case studies as well that chart how a lot of activity that's happening is actually kind of having a benefit financially as well. So how the culture sector is benefiting us financially, because there seem to be all of these really interesting opportunities and programs in place, like the one you mentioned, Gala, with the sensei, but maybe things that we don't necessarily know about because they're not in our locality. So being able to have almost like a database or somewhere where you can start to search and kind of learn from different sort of cultural institutions how they're sort of navigating this as well is quite interesting. I know I'm speaking about that from an example with a climate justice organisation I work with in the UK called Radical Ecology, and they put on this programme called Open City in Plymouth, and this was a couple of years ago, and it was speaking in a local context to the history of colonialism within Plymouth, which is this port city. It's famous for the Mayflower ship sailing out of there to Massachusetts, and it's got like a really interesting history because it's known as a city of culture. It's got 10 NPOs, which in the UK are national portfolio organisations, so kind of cultural organisations of significance. So they're trying to think about how they can mobilise arts and culture to kind of speak to the colonial history of the city, but also build connection and find ways of making culture more accessible across all of our respective communities. And so the programme that Radical Ecology put on there was all about essentially trying to build connection across different communities and think about how these hyper-local issues also spoke to global kind of conversations around movement through water, for example, apartheid, and sort of trying to create connection as well. So bringing in artists from elsewhere, but also speaking to artists who were very hyper-locally working in Plymouth. And so maybe there's a way in which the programming can sort of create that right balance as well between speaking to the local and the planetary.
I think that's a great segue to that kind of the second part of that conversation about what the real opportunity is for exchange. It's not just about how can we do better now that our best friend is mean to us. And I wonder, Clayton, you program a festival, but you've done lots of weird residencies too. So you probably have lots of thoughts about what could be what could have reciprocity, reciprocal. What could be reciprocal?
Yeah, I mean, I think reciprocity in this context is tricky. And I think it depends on predefined structures, I think, to support them. And what I mean by this is when I was at Rhubarb, we created this kind of contemporary performance exchange program where we partnered with 3 European/UK festivals, and the idea was to send artists to each other's context and kind of receive artists from each other's context, which of course worked quite nicely. And this was a kind of very legibly reciprocal kind of exchange that we built in, and that kind of Canada Council supported as a sector innovation, whatever. But I think in these kinds of one-off things, you know, it's like when I get invited to a residency in Hong Kong, for example, it's like I don't necessarily think of that as in a kind of immediate reciprocal kind of relationship. It's certainly kind of a long-term relationship I want to build on and to find kind of avenues for future things, but it's not, I don't think it can be as simple as like, okay, I'm going to go over to Hong Kong, therefore I will bring an artist from Hong Kong over. Like, that's not how it works. And I think the kind of reality of this industry is the kind of long-termness of it, right? Like a relationship I built 5 years ago will manifest in 10 years. And that's just how it works. And it speaks to a kind of ongoing need to kind of keep pushing out these conversations in a way, right? And keep insisting with our funding bodies to support this work. Because it's like, in this kind of, you know, this larger conversation around like making a business case for the arts is difficult, right? Because it's not, you know, you invested $10 today, therefore you're going to get $10 the next year, right? It's these kind of seeds that we're watering over long periods of time. So I kind of challenge this kind of immediate kind of reciprocal thing, I think, to a certain extent. Because it doesn't give that kind of legible success in the short term that kind of our funders or sponsors kind of crave.
Yeah, I wonder, with Gala and Iman, you're both doing residencies right now here in Canada. I wonder if each of you could just speak about like if what we should be thinking about to make doing a residency here attractive from your perspectives.
I mean, Connected Minds is great. I cannot imagine a better conditions actually, because it's basically like you're working on a project. They don't ask you anything in the sense of they don't ask you for any form of retribution. You know, that sometimes this kind of I've done a lot of residencies, and that sometimes it's very like the conditions are a bit not that great for the artists, because basically the time that you spend in the residency is just time that you're working for the organization that is hosting you, either giving, you know, children médiation culturelle, like with kids, like, you know, like work, I don't know, it's just like, okay, I came here to work on a project, and you're taking all my time to, like, you know, using me as like, look, we brought these artists and I just don't know time for my project. So yeah, I guess a good thing is accepting this idea that, you know, we're bringing someone and we need to leave this person alone to work. No, really, a little bit, like, let them work without asking them maybe a form of, but also I think let them work and connect them with the tissue of the city, of the local scene, right? Which is also something that I think is very important, and that Helen, like the person that is coordinating the Connected Minds residency at York, has done very well with me. Like I arrived and we were making a list of, okay, which are the places in Toronto that are linked to cinema, film, moving image, whatever, and we made it. And then she was connecting me because she, for some reason, I don't know, I guess Toronto is kind of small in the art world. She knew all these people, so she was like, you know, so now I basically know all the artistic directors of all the cinemas and festivals in town, which is long-term relationships, I hope. The director of Images Festival is already kind of thinking of inviting me next year. So it's like this kind of how to have someone that is not staying on the surface, but actually, if it's only for 6 months, but like actually getting a bit deeper on the social fabric of the art scene, of the local art scene.
So not so many constraints on like what needs to be made, but like some real resources into having that person be part of the scene of their form.
Yeah, getting the and I guess of course it's a bit like you have to give the organization something, right? Like they're funding your residency, they're funding your life for 6 months, which is amazing. But I guess doing your project with local collaborators, which is also something that I'm doing, presenting your work in the city, which I've also done, giving workshops, so basically like sharing your practice with the local people, but not so much that it becomes the only activity that you're doing, because then it's not allowing you to advance on your project. Basically, this is, which I've had this experience before. Yeah. And I think something very interesting in the best residencies that I've done are always linked with or a topic or local. Like it's like you have to have a reason to be here, right? That is, I don't know, like I did one in Madrid for a year, and they asked for all the candidates to have a reason to be in Madrid, a link with Spain or Madrid. Like, you know, there has to be some kind of form of interaction with the country you're visiting.
Thank you. Iman?
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I think it's finding that commonality as well to begin with, like that sort of shared or mutual interest, which comes a lot through like the process of listening and sort of figuring out what it is you want to do before the residency actually happens. So for us, like Sunny, who's the curator on this residency, there was a lot of like building work that sort of went into sort of planning it beforehand and sort of thinking about kind of what we wanted to do when I was here. And so that felt really important, and it came from like something very specific that I think we were all sort of mutually interested in as well, and what could happen out of that. But also during my time here, Sunny has organised lots of opportunities like you to meet other artists and creatives and people kind of working in different fields between art and ecology, which is where my interest lies. And that has been really interesting for me, because I think those conversations, though they might not be kind of recorded interactions or might not necessarily my spin as well of my time here and this locality specifically, and I hope that those conversations will also sort of reach back and sort of I can offer something that is kind of like a translation of what I'm hearing and listening to. Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but it's a really interesting book all about kind of how we can learn about the systems, how in social justice movements we can learn about systems at play within nature. So whether it's like the sort of movements of ants, for example, or starlings, and in that, like she talks about interdependence and how it's not about like the equality that those interactions sort of offer in real time, and sometimes you can't, like within a reciprocal relationship, see like what's emerging straight away that is that sort of kind of balance between what you're giving and taking from a place, and sometimes it takes a lot longer for that, and so just giving room for that feels really important as well.
Can I or not?
Yeah, please
can I
do.
say-
Yes.
And I think what I'm interested in saying is kind of flipping, like changing the direction of, you know, I think the two of them, like the two of you have come to Canada in this kind of residency context, which I think is really great. But I think flipping it on its head in terms of like Canadian artists kind of going out, I think the ongoing problem, frankly, is the kind of lack of understanding what the international context is, right? Especially in the framework of contemporary performance or theater or dance or whatever. It's like, artists who are working in Canada in those kind of milieus are trying to get gigs within the country for the most part, right? They're actually just not aware of the kind of avenues that are open to them internationally. And I think I also wonder, like, what are the strategies to open up those conversations too, right? So, like, you know, if you attend a festival like FTI, you can get access to those presenters in small ways. But actually, for the rest of the country, it's like, what are those avenues? And how does that actually shift the kind of imagination towards a quote-unquote career presenting work internationally, if that makes any sense.
Now is the time we should add some chairs to, you know, facilitate further contributions to this conversation. And while we're doing that, I'll offer an anecdote thought, which is the producer of the movie The Apprentice has been like on the front of all of our news media here in Canada, because you know The Apprentice is this movie that's made about Donald Trump, and then they won all the awards at the Canadian Screen Awards, and so he had this statement. I guess I didn't see it, but I quoted in the newspaper. It said like he was talking back to the director of the film via the camera, and he was saying like, if you want to make I told you, whatever your name is, director, if you want to make serious work, you need to come to Canada, because you can't make it down there anymore. Which made me really happy, because Dan, the producer, I've known since high school, so that was really nice. But also, I reflected on it kind of separate from my personal connection. I was like, oh, is that the opportunity here? Like that this is the place where serious work could happen? Like, we brand ourselves as that?
I mean, if the Apprentice film is defined as serious art, then I
Oh, snap. I haven't seen it, but that's a funny comment.
Well,
Yeah, but
no offense to your
or
friend.
difficult work that might be difficult to make elsewhere, maybe. I mean, but I don't think again that's us in being defined in relation to the United States as opposed to just doing the work we need to do here, tell the stories we have to hear. I think if there are opportunities to be bolder, like if people feel that way, that's a good thing. If that's true. And maybe that's true in film. And film is like way, there's way more money involved. So the stakes are different and the investors, and if that movie does well, people will be emboldened and that's a good thing. I mean, I think to Clayton's point about, like Canadian artists being, maybe unaware of international opportunities or places to go and present their work. I mean, that comes back then to the presenters locally in any given city about who are they bringing in that then can become the beginnings of relationships for artists. Not in a sort of like economic reciprocal arrangement, but just by exposure, like by meeting people. I mean, if I like at Luminato, the favorite project you're not supposed to have a favorite, but I do. The favorite project I ever worked, like the most amazing to me project I worked on was to work on Walk with Amal, which, I had, she's, I don't know, for those who don't know, a 12-foot puppet who walked from the Syrian border to the UK to talk about, originally sort of inspired by the plight of Syrian refugees coming across Europe, and then since came to Toronto, had a 5 days in 15 encounters in 15 parts of the city with 15 different arts organizations, and by doing that, those arts organizations all became connected to the festival, but they also had this incredible relationship, which was some of it was done online initially, and then some in-person visits, but with these great collaborators who are like amongst the really great international theater makers from the UK and largely Palestinian and British theater makers. Make up the core of the team, but also the puppets are made in South Africa, and like it's a super international project from it, like the team that makes it, and then that comes, and then the stories in Toronto are very international stories because you're going to Brampton and you're telling a South Asian story, and you're going to you're telling you're walking through Kensington Market and you're telling a different story. Like it's and it was just this incredible tool to like engage with a lot of local artists, but also to connect them to these great international artists who some of whom may continue to collaborate with them. And then the other opposite thing is a project like Mahabharata, which Why Not Theatre did, which is, a Canadian production, absolutely, like all Canadian money, 90% Canadian team, but the other 10% of the team are from all over the world, and all South Asian diasporic communities from mostly the UK, Australia, Malaysia, and India. But they've all, they are traveling as a Canadian company with an ancient Indian story. Like it's this, and that too feels like I now know people. I was lucky enough to work on it briefly, and that I know these people. The great privilege of the work that I feel like I've gotten to do is I have these relationships with people around the world, but that means that the people I know, I can say to Clayton, oh, you need I know this great actor who lives in Liverpool that's close to Birmingham, you should connect with him, whatever. I mean, we can continue to tie ourselves to each other and, and weave our communities together, which makes us all more accountable to each other. So when bad shit happens in other parts of the world, we have friends there who we care about, who we're responsible to, who we have to help. And if we want to, that's part of the activism for me, is being responsible to the people I know around the world and that I know because of the work I do. Lucky me. But for an audience that may not have the experience that I have, your responsibility as a presenter is then to bring those stories into every community that you can, because then that's what, that's the efficiency of and for people who, if you can't afford to travel, you can travel to your local theater and have an experience that's international. And that also may be about your family from 3 generations ago, or your, whatever. That's
Perfect timing.
yes.
Would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm Pratim Sengupta. I'm a professor at the University of Calgary, and my work lives at the intersection of education, computer science, but mainly over the last decade I've been working on counter memories from really a theatrical perspective. And I wanted to offer a disorientation to the conversation. Only because for the last 5 years, with colleagues in sociology and medicine, and my wonderful students, one of whom is here, I've been working with newcomer youth of color. And these are young people who have faced forced migration, and they have been resettled, and the projects are these are well-funded, heavily funded projects, and I'm grateful for that. And they are there to the funding is to help us understand the experiences of resettlement beyond the policies and the processes, and what we find is sadly unsurprising, that childhoods and youth, as we have defined it, don't exist for youth facing forced migration. And what they, over the last 5 years, over the last 3 years that we've been working with this group of youth, they have chosen various kinds of representational work as the way to engage with us and with society. And initially, we thought that it's just a matter of storytelling and story work. Over time, well within, I would say, the first year, into the first year, we realized that this is about something else. This is about dignity. When they have been resettled first of all, the residential segregation is just apparent. The city core where we live, and even if you look at the tree cover map, it's all green where we live, and it's industrial, almost 85% industrial where they have been resettled. You know that, right? And this is, and even access to green spaces, connection with land is not something that they can even establish. When I visit their homes, the sidewalks are not inviting because every house has about 5 cars. If there are 5 members, adult members, each person has to go to a different job to make ends meet, right? And so the street is packed, and the kids, all they do is the youth, they walk from their home to the bus stop, and that's it. That's the interaction with the city. When they come back home, they have to do the housework. Right. So, and why am I saying all this? Because what happens to theater, what happens to art, if there is a systemic and systematic destruction of childhood and youth, right? And so this is, if you think into the future, will most of the world be facing forced migration, given that most of the world's peoples live outside the good parts of the world, good as in financially good parts of the world, right? And so what happens there? Even yesterday, I thought the conversations on gathering and anthems were great, but they're already settled conversations. We're assuming a settled population. But most of these youth, even when they're settled, they're settled by force. They're happy to be here, but they have severed connections by force. The state doesn't allow them to connect back with the lands that they have left and the families that they have left, if you're a refugee, for their safety, right? And so, anyway, in that mess, given that most of the world outside Canada, we are a nation of many nations, but we are also a nation among lots of other nations, right? And it's the other nations that I worry about, and that we don't speak of. Just a thought.
That's a great disorientation to the international context. I like this question of the art, like, climate change is real. Hi, climate change is real. And there is going to be a lot more forced migration. Like, this is a fact. And so I think one thing that I pick up from that offer is about, like, the art that will be required in the future is not the art that is required now as we enter into probably more precarity, more disaster, more kind of like haves and have-nots.
But there's forced migration in Canada this week because of climate change. And there's a whole bunch of people from northern Saskatchewan who've just arrived to live in St. Catharines.
Yeah.
Like, so what do you do for them? Like, what do we do for, how do we respect their culture in a very different kind of town? Like, we are not the safe haven either. I mean, we parts of this country are probably safe for a while from climate change, or safer, but we're not immune. And I just think it's an interesting question. We can start to practice whatever that is, like how the art is different. We don't have to wait.
But also the art is important, because for these youth who have been resettled, they attend schools, but they are tracked completely separately. And it almost feels like you're back in Jim Crow southern US. The remedial classes that they're put in, and you see the difference in color. You walk into these spaces. And it's for them to be able to engage in theatrical work, to engage in filmmaking, to engage in creating these immersive simulations, for them, it's dignity. And so that, to me, is a more profound realization that is what art was for them. It truly became a place where they saw themselves as intellectuals, not just bodies. And by the way, without fail, every single non-South Asian kid in that group has been forced into, like, they wouldn't call it forced themselves, but we see it. They're being forced, even as we speak, into vocational low-wage body labor. And this is happening through the school's counseling program, right? They're not being told that you can be a photographer. They're not being told that you can be an artist. They're not being told that you can do all these other millions of things.
And they're also being exposed to your program as a specialized program, not a given, not like somebody spoke to yesterday, like that there's not art and theater and music and dance integrated into the school system anymore as just part of the regular curriculum. You're special. You come in for 3 years. You change a cohort's lives. You make an amazing example, and then you might disappear. And then what happens to the next group of kids?
And that's a big question for us, to the point where I think I've more or less consciously taken the decision to let them reorient what I do professionally in the future. So, and I can do that because of the academic privilege I have. I wouldn't be able to do that if I was just starting out as an assistant professor 17 years back. And so there are lots of layers in between, because the academy would reward me for a good paper. That's in the end. And the dollars that come in for funding.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that. I almost stepped into the last conversation to kind of make a similar point, which is that I do think that, there's different levels of privilege, and also like the concept of risk came up earlier, and that in particular institutions will always be risk adverse, especially the administrators of institutions, and so those of us who have positions of privilege, and in particular tenured professors I was thinking of, that is a lot incumbent on us right now to push back against things that are just actually risk adverse but can have really damaging effects, for sure.
But fear is real, though. I mean, I have to be careful. We have to, my colleagues and I have to be careful about posting images, like photos of work that they're doing online because of being doxxed. It has already happened to one of my collaborators. I mean, it's a very real threat.
Yeah, there's risk for all of us, it's true.
I can move out and make space for someone else.
Ariane's here, though.
Hi.
Hi.
My name's Ariane Michaud. I'm thinking about this idea, you brought it up, I think, halfway through, this idea that, and this is still, I'm forming this thought as I'm speaking it, but the idea that we can tell the youth that they can do whatever they want, that they can be artists, this languaging is really important in some contexts, but I think it can be dangerous in others. I'm thinking in particular, I worked with an organization called Juntos Collective, which it brought intercultural exchange opportunities between artists, specifically dancers in the United States and dancers in Latin America. We brought them together in Latin America to do workshops, to work in hospitals, but also to just be dancers together, to come into that space. And we would work with a lot of youth. And one of the big messages of that organization was you can do anything that you want to do. These were a lot of, young people that were inevitably through, economically disadvantaged, and usually lived and would continue to live the lives that their families would live, right? Which is they would stay in the same home, they wouldn't make a lot of money, they would do physical labor, things like that. And we practiced that messaging quite strongly at the beginning. You can do it, you can be an artist, and there were some really positive stories. Actually, some people that came to York University, and one young man who became kind of a radio TV host, and those were really positive. But what we also saw was that many of the young individuals that heard that messaging then used it in ways where they too were exploited. So a group of artists from a very small barrio in Guatemala started working for a big amusement park that needed performers. Performers that were doing sometimes 3, 4, 5 shows a day on stage. They were asking to learn how to flip, how to do things that their bodies were not made for. None of our bodies are made for that stuff. But they also were never taken care of. They weren't given health care, and they weren't told how to take care of their bodies. So what we were seeing over time is, originally with this group of people, our messaging was, you can do anything that you want to do, and then a few years later we're coming in and we're teaching them how to take care of their bodies, how to avoid injuries. So many of them had back problems at that point, young men especially, in their 20s, who could barely walk. And so that messaging, I'm thinking about it in an international context, how differently, these American young dancers being you can do it, and then how that translated into a form of financial freedom for them, but also very short term, right? And then what happens is they end up going back to the barrio because they can no longer sustain what they've given to the community. They can't keep their bodies functioning. So I don't know where I'm going with this, but that messaging can be so different depending on where you are.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Funny anecdote, I'm reminded of my dad. When I called him to say that we bought our first home in Nashville, I was teaching in Vanderbilt at that time, he was surprised that someone gave a professor a loan to buy a house. And I asked him, why are you surprised? And he's a banker, and he was like, why would anyone pay you for writing papers that no one reads? and that's so. Imagine convincing him that I would now be an artist.
Yeah.
I guess also.
Yeah, I think this is kind of. Oh, sorry. You can go ahead.
It's fine. Go ahead.
You go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is kind of couching into kind of my current kind of obsessive question of actually, there's been a trend in the last 10 years, 10, 20 years around the professionalization of the arts, right? What does it mean to be an artist who makes their money off being art, who makes their money off being an artist? And the ways in which that's been a productive and generative conversation, but also the way, in my opinion, the ways in which it's actually destroying things in many ways, right? It's actually, what if we think about art as a necessity, art as a necessity, and what happens when we remove the conversation of pay from that? Like, what are the things that open up when we do that as a provocation?
You're going to say something.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I guess thinking about, I guess, time and progress and how, I mean, I was speaking to one of your colleagues or your PhD student earlier about his work, kind of, well, with story work, but thinking about like animation and clay. Yeah, and that was really interesting because the way you were speaking about working with clay with the communities you're working with is like actually using clay as a medium to almost speak in another language, but it was also making me think back to sort of research I was doing around how clay also, like the process of touching clay, for example, has healing properties versus like if you were to use clay with gloves on, it doesn't have that same kind of process of kind of healing like within your body. And so I think there are ways in which kind of we experience, in a very privileged sense, the way in which art sort of allows us to be resilient and allows us to heal. But like the ways in which maybe that's not necessary, we don't make that connection to climate and social justice efforts either. So what are the ways in which kind of research around that can sort of help build a case for kind of actually working with art in a way that is kind of in the moment and for that resilience and for that dignity that you speak to rather than for any end output or goal. And maybe that in itself like allows us to think about like what it's offering in that moment now rather than, and allows us to kind of use it as a space of imagination to think about an alternative future without kind of putting any weight or pressure on kind of some form of progress or change in a way that feels like it's going towards something that we can't yet quite grasp in a way. So I wonder whether there's something about like time which we can start to explore within art, in which I think we sort of enter this very different notion and understanding of time that helps us to deal with major issues that we're facing right now as well.
Actually, your work is a direct inspiration for some of the work that some of these youth want to do in the garden, following the potato, the colonial history of the potato. Yeah, and the reason I bring this up is because it was so part of this project, big project, involves them actually taking over a private residential garden and turning that into a community garden, and it's brilliant work that they're leading. And as soon as they started touching soil, they started talking about home in ways that they had never talked about before. So maybe, and I was noting down your comment on time, but even like maybe there is something between the local and the non-local, and that's the immediately local presence. Like in this moment, why are we so taken by words and ideas and not by the sensations? And I think art is a great way to ask these questions.
Hi, I'm Shantanu. Just to kind of build on the idea that, well, of course, we are here in a community of professionals, all of us, not me though, I'm not really an artist, but I kind of work with art with children, as Dr. Sengupta was mentioning. But also I think part of taking art into the community is also to realize the youth themselves, what part of their lived sensations and feelings can be intellectually valued as art, even though they themselves do not see themselves immediately, is also to open up the more technical aspects of art through a form of collaborative making, I would say. It's not that they always come with the know-how of it, but the know-how is really very simple, that an artist can provide. What is really needs to focus is these counter stories of pain, of the loss of dignity, of loss of land, of trying to imagine a home, and just really focusing on the microscopic granularity of their emotions that are really not addressed in the procedurality of their schools, their resettlement, the larger system which is kind of always against them. So the artist or the person who is bringing art to them is also trying to bridge their emotions of what you're feeling as negative, what you're feeling as a loss is valid. It's important. It's beautiful, and you're not really simply alone in it. We are all part of the structures that has brought you here, but you're not really left with your own. So I think just doing that work, that labor with them, the emotional labor of caring for their stories, really makes whatever that we are facing. It could be something ecological, which could be something more societally relevant as forced migration, could be issues of racism and resettlement that we face in the Canadian context as well.
Thank you for offering that. I think this conversation takes such a fascinating turn, and I feel like what you just offered connects really well to what Clayton was offering earlier. Is he's just kind of being like, "Hey guys, what if we take money out of this conversation? Because art isn't actually money. We need it to do it and pay people." And it made me just reflect that that I think is part of the difference between Quebec-based artists and the rest of the artists where we kind of started this conversation, which is to say that I think Quebecois people, to speak for people, which is probably not the greatest idea, but just to put an idea out there, view culture and the arts as a part of everyday life. And so, that might then lead to the government funding it more, but that's just a response to that sense that art and culture is just a part of life, whether kind of people are getting an artist fee or not for what they're doing. Whereas then when we started to talk about the other nations in Canada, we started to be like, these professional artists, what are the opportunities for them? And so I just wonder if that opens up anything for about what arts and culture could be in these other nations.
Yeah, I think we also can't remove the kind of context of arts funding being slashed, or not arts funding, arts education funding being basically slashed, over the past 35 years, right? Where artists now, especially in the conversation that we were just having, is artists are now expected to be, in many ways, community workers, right? And I think that works for a lot of artists, and I think that makes a lot of sense in many ways. But it's actually, that isn't the kind of one-fits-one model, right? Where I think the government, in using arts funding, expects artists to be this kind of catch-all for doing the kind of community work that they're failing to do. But actually, how do we separate this out as recognizing both of these are valid, but also separate? Because it's you do not want me working with students or working with children. It's that's terrible. It's that's truly a terrible idea.
Absolutely.
I kind of totally disagree. I think you would be the best with kids. But...
You haven't seen my new work. It's not.
Okay. All right. Fair enough.
There's something though that I don't agree with, and maybe this is a very unpopular opinion. I do not think we should encourage everyone to be artists or that everyone can become an artist. And I don't think art should be considered as something that is part of everyday life. Art comes with, being an artist comes with, it's a profession as well. It comes with knowing a history, having knowledge, technical knowledge, having it's not a hobby. And I think picturing it as something that is just everyone can do it. It's one of the reasons why they're defunding art. It's one of the reasons why they're not respecting art. No one can, not everyone can make a film. I'm sorry, but it took me years of studying and watching films and trying to make them and failing. And it's not something, I don't know, it could be used as an argument to delegitimize that actually artists, we are professionals. We just as a judge or a doctor.
Yeah.
It's not just something we do for fun. Or
But I think what Clayton was, when you say 35 years of defunding arts education in the schools, in elementary schools and high schools, that's not about creating artists. That's also about creating art. That's about creating audiences and people who don't mind that there are artists who are paid out of their tax dollars and who don't feel that's a frivolous expense and who feel it's legitimate. And in terms of, somebody talked about subsidizing, mining and resource extraction is subsidized right across the country, big time. So, and relatively speaking, the arts are not. And I think, there's got to be a way, it's about, I don't know. I mean, it's very simplistic, but the way, everybody people listen to the radio. Most people like music a little bit, most people like to have a picture on their wall where even if it's just a calendar from, the gas station. And like most people they like their clothes, like they're interested in all of these things that are fed by artistic practice at the base, and yet we don't make those connections. Like somebody who loves, a Broadway singer doesn't realize they went to Sheridan College and they, had, a possibility of being in, Oklahoma in grade school or whatever. Like that there's long trajectories here that create both, and that, high art and, commercial art and other art are actually inextricably intertwined. And that message just seems to have been dismissed over time. And in the States, the until just now, I mean, one of the reasons that the NEA was not as important in the States is just because also there were philanthropists who who believed in the arts, and there's masses of money that's made in Hollywood that maybe then gets given to the universities in California to develop and support artists. So I think there's a couple of missing pieces in Canada that we could look internationally for other examples. And then you look to, the global south where there may not be, there's not arts funding. That doesn't mean there isn't art in all of those countries. And there's filmmakers and there's writers and, there's also do we over-privilege our position? Those are two sides of a completely different.
I feel like there's a tension that can coexist here because one time I did very serious conservatory art training programs, so I really actually believe in that arts are a craft and people develop an expertise and should be treated differently. But also people who know me know I really like basketball, and if I see a bunch of people playing pickup basketball, I'm not amateurs. All of these people playing basketball, that leads to then there being a professional basketball league where these guys get paid millions of dollars, and women now. And so there has to be this whole undercarriage, I don't want to say underclass, of people who engage in it and can respect the highest level of it, I think.
Yeah.
That's the end of my thought. Jessie?
Hi, I'm Jessie. I absolutely think that everybody should have an opportunity, but I know that not everybody can or will, right? And that there are realities that I think in the current arts education systems where we're trying to get as many people into classes and get people through, that I don't think that we quite grasp that reality, and we're pushing people out into a world where there is not the work for them, and there is not the sort of balance of how are you going to live your life in reality. We talked about kids going into the sand or into the soil, and having that moment where they're reconnected to their roots. You talk about time and clay. My brain means play, but I when I think about play, I think often about a rope, in sailing, when you want to have a little bit of play in your rope, as in there's a little bit of give and there's a little bit of take, because if it's tense, you're going over. And when I think about the education system, and I think about all the people who get programming as kids who don't go into the arts, the potential for them to learn that there's a little bit of give and take in every situation, that there's time to dig your hands into the soil, that there's time to take a breath, that your relative can come into your home and have a moment to actually, okay, I see, it's not quite what I thought it was, as opposed to these tensions that are held from these beliefs that I find in our globalized world, we're further and further from each other. And so we lose our ability to have these conversations, to take this time to interact together. We lose our sense of play. Yeah, end of thought.
Welcome.
Hi, my name is Tracy, and it's a similar thread that Jessie and our other colleagues were... Pratim was speaking of, and Shante. And just that... and also bringing back the thread of not normalizing ways of being that we were talking about in the American context earlier today. That art as a way of being is something that needs to be sustained and encouraged. And these larger systems that you were speaking about that are not taking into account care, affect, emotions, experiences, sensations. And so it's just really important in arts education to include the arts, and it doesn't discount this professional system. It's I think what generates it, and just the interconnections. So I'm kind of echoing things that were said, but that these are all go hand in hand, and that the arts encourage a way of being that we need right now. If we normalize economic, there's so many things that are being pushed by the broader system that we really need to, if we're talking about resistance and we're talking about building other ways of being, getting your hands on the soil and talking about where you come from and culture, I really believe in the work you're doing as well.
I wonder.
Sorry, I just want to react briefly. I was never implying that we should stop art education or that, I'm just saying that being professionals is the reason why you get a salary, and that art is a way of just putting a point there, that it's, if we start believing too much in this idea that art is in every micro thing you do in your everyday life, it's like, no, art is, it's an economic activity, and I should be paid a salary for this because this is how I pay my rent. I mean, you know what I mean? It's just this balance between, of course, everyone should get an opportunity. Of course, we should educate kids and, connect them or confront them to art every day. That's not what I mean. I'm just saying that this argument could very fast become a weapon to say, oh, you're giving this talk, you should do it for free because, it's you know what I mean? It's like, no, this is my job. This is, it's a professional activity, and this is how I sustain my life from a material point of view. I need money for this.
Right, and it's conflating with here, even locally, where artists are expected to return to the community and offer workshops or whatnot, and not just get funded to make some art.
Exactly.
That's what I meant.
I'm going to throw to Jessie to close us down.
I was going to say something similar, maybe, that I think that saying that the arts education has to be the filter to the arts industry is problematic for me. I think that as people who have connections with each other in the world and who understand or don't understand the different stories, learning to be comfortable speaking in front of people, learning how to listen, learning how to play a game together. And if we play well together on opposite teams, we play together, right? I know that if I play my game so that you can play too, we're going to have more fun. And that is completely separate from this idea that I can make plays as a career move or as the way that I support myself. There's so many different variants of that and reasons for that. I just wanted to kind of keep that those things, I think, are in fact different. Not that the artist can't do the education or that the educators or the children can't become the artists, but that kind of learning is more important for us to function as a society that's increasingly divided. End of thought.
Thank you. That concludes our international discussion. Thank you so much to conversation starters. Thank you to everyone who jumped in. Thank you, of course, to the listeners, too. We can always feel your energy here. And we have one more conversation. It will be also about 75 minutes. I think we're really concentrating this day on making everything so that the cognitive load of the day is manageable for all of us, which is a thing. But sandwiches are available. It's really nice outside. Have some water, have some coffee, and we'll do this once more. The technological context will be led by Adrian.
Thanks.
See ya.
Yeah. It's a nuanced,